on here, and in particular, just how busy it is. You can hear the frequency of the traffic a few metres overhead, or lack thereof. Very strange noise. But for a 4-lane highway, it is actually just a tad quiet.
Oh, it's heavy. Oh. I'm free.
They kindly left that unbolted for me. Now, I mentioned the lack of traffic. It's not surprising really, because while it matches the Golden Gate Bridge in scale, instead of linking San Francisco to its Golden Peninsula, this links Barton to Hessel, just outside Hull. You might ask why it was built. Well, the process that got it underway was, let's say, the kind of thing that gives politics a bad name.
The year of 1966 found Harold Wilson in a fix, with his overall majority down to 2. He just couldn't face rejection at the Hull North by-election. Barbara Castle came to see what she could do.
There had been debates about schemes for bridging the Humber for over a century before, but the huge costs and engineering difficulties saw them all off. Boat remained the only option. When the local Labour MP suddenly died, Prime Minister Harold Wilson's majority was cut to 2. Wilson cynically sanctioned the building of the bridge in the hope of swinging the by-election in his favour. Minister of Transport Barbara Castle announced, "Hull shall have its bridge," just before the by-election.
You'll get your Humber Bridge and there won't be much delay.
Joseph Kevin McNamara, Labour, 24,479.
Labour hung on to their tiny majority, and Hull got its bridge.
As for the new bridge, no one disputes it's a triumph of British engineering. What remains to be seen is whether it will prove the critics right when they call it the bridge from nowhere to nowhere.
It's worth saying, it wasn't just a bridge to nowhere, it also epitomised many of the other problems associated with infrastructure that I remember from my youth. Far from collaboration, it was blighted by conflict. In the era of the 1970s, it reflected the state of Britain at the time, with industrial relations problems.
The management were having to face industrial troubles in the industrial climate of the 1970s, when there was the 3-day week, there was wage restraint. The unions were very much in control. One classic case, there was a plague of ladybirds in 1976, and it was slippy. So the welders and platers refused to come out of the cabin because it was dangerous, and they went on strike. And then they would go on strike the following day to get paid for the day that they were on strike.
Whether it's managing industrial relations or political decision-making, building bridges well is as much about people as concrete and cables. We all know that the human factor plays a very big part in these projects.
I think there are 3 items in a project. There is the design and construction of it, there is the money of it, and there's the human element. And if you have a little triangle, you have a pound sign at one corner, an integral sign for design and construction, and a Lowry matchstick man in the other corner.
The human factor.
Yes.
It always comes down to human beings. A good bridge needs every element to be right, not just one. The Humber didn't score on all of them. It opened in 1981 and was supposed to pay for itself through tolls, but it never did. Sadly, the Humber is an example of just one way in which our democracy sometimes fails to deliver the infrastructure we need. combination of poor political decision-making and expensive construction means that we've sometimes built the wrong things and they've cost too much. To be honest, given our record, it's not altogether surprising that for many years in this country, we've been phobic about investing in infrastructure. That partly explains why we have such crowded trains and just one high-speed rail line. And that's why High Speed 1 was so important as a turning point. It's a sign the knack is coming back. No one could say we're getting it all right. There are still some disasters lurking out there. But something has changed. High Speed 1 was just one sign we found a bit of our inner Victorian. And with the economy in the doldrums right now, what better time is there to give ourselves a Victorian-style makeover? Certainly the Victorian era was one of huge industrial and technological change. Our society was transformed by engineering ingenuity and entrepreneurial prowess. The role of national government was not to pay the bills back then, but to let local government and private investors get on with it. And the private sector did fund a lot, paying the upfront costs and then billing consumers if all went to plan. It was their risk. And it's how London got its underground. So Christian, just tell us where we are. What is the significance of this carriage in which we're sitting?
Well, we are in the first carriages on the City and South London Railway, which opened in 1890, and it was London's first deep tube cut out of the clay. And the promoters thought, well, actually, there's nothing to see, so why bother having windows?
This is key infrastructure. These days, we tend to think government has a very big role in those kinds of things. What was the general approach towards the infrastructure construction in those days?
The amazing thing is that the London Underground was financed by private people and not necessarily rich people. Somebody would come up and say, we want to build this line, come and invest in it, and they would hope to make money out of it. And some of them did, and some of them didn't.
There was a sort of can-do about it, which is admirable, even though it was quite a messy process in the end.
It's probably more sensible to plan, and particularly today when you've got so much existing infrastructure already. But in the kind of heyday of Victorian gung-ho capitalism, I think it was the right thing for people just to come up with ideas, because they probably came out with more original ideas and came up with schemes that the government would never necessarily have thought of. And it did go through a sort of process by Parliament. It was slightly corrupt. You could buy off your MPs to kind of make sure it got through. But essentially, they created a system of infrastructure on the basis of taking risks that, you know, we are eternally grateful for. Without them, you know, we might not have had the underground.
Private finance and risk-taking with a little help from the politicians. Well, it got some results. So here's a question. Could we have a surge in investment in infrastructure on a Victorian scale now? Not perhaps in the Victorian style, it was quite messy, but even without a full-on buccaneering speculator-led boom like the Victorians, could we at least deliver the modern equivalent? The answer is half a yes. One reason for optimism is that today's private sector does get on with the job of rebuilding Britain without getting much attention when the conditions are right. Near this park is an example of the sort of thing I mean. You probably haven't heard of it. You could pass by it every day without realising it, but you'd soon know if it wasn't there. To see it, you have to enter via a highly secure and cleverly disguised building. The door is a portal into a whole world below London. You may wonder why I'm cycling down here where the scenery gets quite samey. It's the easiest way to get around, of course. This is a 20-kilometre long tunnel. It's part of a network housing high-voltage cables for the capital's electricity. The network has some of the deepest tunnels in London. And this investment from National Grid, well, it's an example of one of the simplest and clearest funding models that you can imagine. It's paid for by the private sector, ultimately, though, paid for by electricity consumers, all subject to independent regulation. It's less spontaneous than Victorian investment, more structured. So, Sarah, I can see tunnels going off in all directions. Where are we?
We are underneath London, somewhere between Elstree and St John's Wood, in National Grid's network of tunnels. In an urban area, really, because it's so densely populated, we have to put the cables underground. And that can cause a lot of disruption if they're shallow and underground and you have to dig up roads. So for the London Tunnels project, we've gone deep underground. It's a huge project, £1 billion, building 32 kilometres of tunnel underneath London, some of it up to 60 metres in depth, and that's really to bring power to Londoners. London takes about 20% of our demand, and that's increasing.
Where does National Grid get £1 billion from?
We put an investment plan together and we go to Ofgem, the regulator, we agree that plan and they agree what revenues, what we're going to earn. And like many other businesses, we go out to the market and raise money, but because we have such certainty over what we're investing and what we're earning, because we're regulated, we can raise that money with confidence.
While this tunnel does have little in common with those dug by Victorian speculators, it's interesting to note some similarities. It's privately financed, politics stays out the way, and above all, the investment actually happens. It's not a perfect system, but there's a lot of utility work to be done in water and energy, and it is being done under this kind of arrangement. So why did I say that's only half a boom? Why can't that give us a whole one? If we know how to build these days, can't the private sector get on with it? Well, the problem is there's a lot of infrastructure investment waiting in the wings that can't be fixed between private utilities, their independent regulators and their customers. The best example of infrastructure poised to be unleashed, but only poised, is nuclear power. A decision's been taken that we need it, but while willing the end, government has yet to will the means. This is Hinkley Point B in Somerset, home to 2 ageing nuclear reactors. Look inside to see the task required to build a replacement. Nuclear power stations are the most expensive and complex bits of infrastructure there is. And it's not just the engineering. Getting them off the ground is complex too, because most of the cost is incurred before you sell any electricity. It's all up front. I've never been in a nuclear power plant before, and I'm now heading into the most secure and critical part of the whole operation.
Wow, big.
This hall sits above the nuclear reactors, and this crane is used to put fuel into those reactors and remove spent fuel.
This is what we call the charge machine. So this is basically the machine that refuels the reactor.
Why does it need to be so tall?
Obviously it needs to be at least the depth of the reactor, so it needs to be capable of taking the longest item in the reactor out.
So it is as high as the reactor is down?
That's correct, yeah. The scale is, as you can see, is huge. Fantastic bit of British engineering there.
At the other side of this enormous crane is one of the nuclear reactors.
So here it is, we're